Controversial former Trump campaign boss Steve Bannon has turned his gaze to Europe. The ex-banker and media executive is now helping far-right parties and their leaders campaign for next year's European parliamentary elections.
He's pouring millions of dollars into polling and public relations to help to create a voting bloc in Brussels that will further extend the influence of Europe's right-wing populists. Europe correspondent Linton Besser spoke to Steve Bannon in Edinburgh.
Steve, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on the show, and thanks for coming to Scotland to do it.
Now, Europeans, by and large, I think you would agree, are among the most affluent people on the planet. Isn't there much to admire about Europe?
Well, I think there absolutely is. But I think if you look at what the crisis is, since the financial crisis, I think what you're talking about is averages that average in the party of Davos and the elites. If you look since the financial crisis, essentially in the West, if you leave China out, I think we've increased $41 trillion of debt of central banks basically flooding the zone to bail out, to raise up asset prices, okay, to bail out the elites. And if you look at it, if you go around to these individual countries, if you ask people in Italy, if you ask people in these individual countries, working class people are struggling. Working class people are living, I essentially say, just like in the United States, and like millennials, it's like 19th century Russian serfs. You don't own anything. You get zero in your savings account now because of what's happened with the flooding zone of liquidity to bail out the wealthy. You can't own a house because real estate prices have gotten out of control. Your pension is going to be worth much, much less, even if you're going to have one. So I think when you look at and really look at, if you triage, right, working class people, and I think this is what drove the blowback on this migrant issue in Italy, is that the whole burden was being put on the social welfare system of the working class.
You reject the charge, Mr. Bannon, that you provide or have provided in the past a platform for racism. If you can, would you set out for me your vision of how the movement, for example, will promote tolerance and respect for all people, regardless of their creed? Well,
I think first off, one thing we've said up front is that, there's no room in anything that we're working with anti-Semitism. If you look at these parties overall, as far as what they're trying to do within their nation, okay, what they're trying to do is kind of save and rebuild their nation in their nation states. I think you are going to see tolerance because I think economic conditions are going to get better. But we're in no situation are we going to work with ethno-nationalists or anti-Semites or anything like that. It's something I absolutely disagree with. In fact, I said earlier today in this media thing, one of the things I've told some of these parties that have come to me is that, hey, if you have these roots that are based in ethno-nationalism, you got to eviscerate that now. And one of the reasons is you're not going to be able to become a majority party. Just middle-class people are not going to accept it as long as it has a thing of ethno-nationalism.
Do corruption and attacks on free speech bother you?
When you say attacks on free speech, I think...
And corruption.
Well, corruption, look, crony capitalism, our stock and trade at Breitbart was going after crony capitalism. The problem we have in the United States is a consolidation of major industries, pharmaceutical, media, technology, with big government. In Italy, the combination of these two things is 5 stars. Entire program is anti-crony capitalism and that's why I said earlier in the Italians that it hasn't been run for the Italian people in 20 years. So now on free speech, I think that is, you have to look at the situation of people are all over Orban. They're all over sometimes Salvini. And I'm a huge admirer of these individuals because I think they've just done a tremendous job.
It's apparent that there is rank corruption in Hungary, for example, and there have been repeated attacks on the freedom of speech by the administration in Hungary. Now, doesn't that bother you?
When you say freedom of speech, I think it's how they define that. I think they see this as a opposition party media funded by outsiders, by NGOs that are out to attack the Hungarian people, and that's why I think you got to look at the facts in Hungary. I think when you go and talk to the people in Hungary, they don't see it that way.
Well, the European Union's raised concerns about the breakdown of the rule of law and attacks on free speech in Hungary and Poland.
I think Orban would come back and say he disagrees with that the EU's on him because he's a representative of kind of this populist nationalist movement.
But there are people that
eventually wants to take over. Look, they fear Salvini. They fear Orban. Okay, here's why they fear him. They're very popular. They're getting more popular. They're getting things done in the country. And these guys are saying, we're not going to have the EU run as has been. Now, one of these guys have said, men or women have said, we want to Brexit. We want to get out of the EU. But they want reform of the EU. They would say the EU is corrupt and full of crony capitalism.
Vladimir Putin and his apparatus in Moscow are quite dedicated for their own foreign policy reasons to see disruption in Europe. would you accept?
Hang for a second.
Can I ask the question? Let me ask the question. Would you accept that Vladimir Putin?
You're making a speech first. And then
Okay. Would you accept?
Finish your speech.
Would you accept that Vladimir Putin would be quite happy to see the work you're doing to unpick European unity?
Why do you say it's European unity? These nation states, as I've said, you're not listening. You're not listening. You got your own agenda. You're not listening. What did I say about the people with the European Union? What did I say?
Well, I'm conducting the interview, not you.
No. But hang on.
It's my interview, Steve.
No, but I understand that. Okay. But I answered this question. I said. I
have asked the question.
Are you listening?
Are
you listening?
I am listening. And my question is this.
You can't answer. I've said this. Every person that we work in an entity does not want the EU to get weaker. They don't want the EU to disband. They don't want to exit the EU. What they want the EU to be is a collection of individual nation states. Now, let's talk about some specifics. Number one, I was a naval officer on a destroyer whose mission was hunting Soviet submarines. I spent 3.5 years of my life doing that in the Pacific, in the Persian Gulf, North Arabian Sea, Western Pacific, okay? Visited Australia a number of times. I went back to the Pentagon. I was a junior officer when Reagan got there on the execution of the war plan against the Soviet Union. I don't need to be told that the Russians are bad guys, okay? I understand that, okay? But here's what I find interesting. President Trump, who's increased our defense spending in Europe with NATO, I think $4.7 billion, principally in Poland and the Baltics against Russia. What he's asking for is that, hey, for NATO to pay 2%, you can't get Germany. Germany's the most hesitant to do this. He's saying if you think Russia's such a big problem, why don't you meet in the 2% so you can kind of have a common defense against it? People said, oh, Trump's an isolationist. Trump has been the one that went to Warsaw, and I think had the most provocative speech, more than Ronald Reagan had the most provocative speech I've ever seen against Russia. And what he told the countries there is that don't do these natural gas and energy deals with Russia, because particularly you, Germany, then you're going to be totally beholden to them. We're prepared to do the natural gas deals with you and leave you independent. So when you hear this about the Russian involvement, number one, there's not one of these nations, I don't think, that wants to make the EU any weaker. What they want is a different focus of it, okay? And they want individual nation states. Now, are some of those individuals reaching out to Russia and meeting with Russia? Sure, certainly they are, but I think that's full thing. But listen, the Russians are bad guys. Putin, these guys, is a kleptocracy. They're bad guys. But for somebody that I spent the better part of my 20s, focused on the Soviet Union as a very junior officer, but still in our military, where our mortal enemy was the Soviet Union, I understand that.
Thank you, Steve.
Great, thanks, brother.
Thank you.